Hello, everyone. My name is Ryan Eborn, and I am here today on behalf of the marketing team with School Health. I'd like to thank you all for joining us today and participating in our emergency oxygen webinar. In today's webinar, we are joined by Dr. Richard Imbruce, as well as Andy Russell, the gentleman from Rapid Oxygen, and they are here to discuss the use of emergency oxygen in those critical moments before emergency responders arrive. Before I turn the time over to Richard and Andy, I would like to review a few quick things about today's webinar. First, we will not be taking audio questions during the webinar, but you can submit your questions through the questions interface in GoToWebinar. You can submit your questions anytime during the presentation. Our presenters are going to take around 45 minutes for their presentation, after which we will take the questions in the order in which they were received. This webinar is being recorded, and a link to the webinar will be hosted on our YouTube channel. We will also email a link out to each of you for future playback and to share with colleagues. Everyone who attends today's webinar will also be receiving a certificate of attendance for joining us today. You should expect those certificates to come over by email later this afternoon. We'll work to start getting those out and sent to each of you as soon as this presentation is over. But it does take us, a little while here on the School Health side to get everything put together and sent out. So keep an eye on your email for that certificate, as well as for the link to the recording of today's presentation. And lastly, if you are having technical difficulties with the audio or visual portion of today's webinar, please call GoToWebinar directly at 855-352-9003. And again, that number for GoToWebinar is 855-352-9003. And now we'll turn the time over to Dr. Richard Imbruce.
Thank you very much, Ryan. I truly appreciate this opportunity to have this discussion, and welcome to everyone attending today. Oxygen, all of a sudden, is prominent, and we're happy to discuss it. What we'll try and recover we're just trying to advance the, there we go. Thank you. What we'll try to cover are the gas laws, understanding oxygen and the physical concepts of oxygen. It applies to all gases. The benefits of oxygen, why emergency oxygen, why public access oxygen, what types of oxygen delivery systems are available, and why the Rapid Oxygen R15 solution is appropriate for its use, and how to use it. And as Ryan suggested at the end, we're happy to answer questions. Oxygen has been around for a long time. Its atomic number, like all chemicals on the periodic table, it has an atomic number. It's 8, and the symbol O. We're accustomed, of course, with the symbol O2 because it's a covalent molecule, and oxygen exists as O2. It was discovered by Joseph Priestley a long time ago. Hasn't changed. 1774. In air, we call this ambient air. Oxygen is 21% by volume. And as we will begin to discuss its concentration, it's the same concentration throughout the atmosphere. It's always 21%. And we'll try to answer the question of why is the oxygen at altitude less, and why do we become hypoxemic at altitude? But there's 21% oxygen in the atmosphere. It's a colorless, odorless, and tasteless gas. It's 2/3 of the mass of the human body in the form of water, H2O. And it's the most abundant element in the Earth's crust, 47%, existing as oxides. A human being uses about 550 liters of pure oxygen per day. Now, the gas law has been around, as we say, since the 17th and 18th centuries. And it hasn't changed. What the gas laws are by Robert Boyle and Jacques Charles and Joseph Gay-Lussac and Avogadro talk about the relationship of pressure, volume, and temperature. To understand pressure, volume, and temperature, I saw this exhibit at the Ripley's Believe It or Not Museum in New York City. And what this represents is what a coffee cup looks like at sea level and where the Titanic resides at 12,500 feet below the sea. Now, notice the size of the cup on the right, and notice the size of the cup on the left. For each 33 feet we descend below the surface of the sea, the pressure increases by 1 atmosphere. An atmosphere of pressure is the pressure exerted by the atmosphere at sea level. If we go down 33 feet, there are 2 atmospheres of pressure. 66 feet, there are 3 atmospheres of pressure. So that volume of the cup at 3 atmospheres, at 66 feet of pressure, would be reduced by 1/3. So we continue down to 12,500 feet, you can see the reduction in size. So the pressure is increased, therefore the volume of the container is decreased. If we breathe at sea level and we descend ourselves, our lung volume is reduced the same way. And that's why we incorporate a scuba tank, a high pressure gas cylinder, which allows us to take in breaths and have the same lung volume at sea level as we do at any depth of the ocean. So the pressure and volume are related in direct relationship as a function of the temperature. If you don't change the temperature, the pressure and volume remain constant. The most prominent of the gas laws is with John Dalton. And this is where oxygen and the benefit of oxygen, breathing, and increasing oxygen concentration of the environment is so important. John Dalton discovered that the total pressure exerted by a gas is equal to the sum of its parts. In air, we have nitrogen, we have oxygen, there are inert gases. So the total pressure, the sum of the partial pressures, is always 100%. Ambient air is 78% of the air is nitrogen, 21% oxygen, and 1% other gases, like argon, krypton, neon, helium. Those are inert gases, 1%. With 100% oxygen, you can begin to see that the oxygen replaces the nitrogen. It doesn't replace the inert gases, but it replaces the nitrogen. So I know last night you were sleeping and wondering about oxygen. And the first thought that came to mind is, how does a molecule of oxygen, how is it transported from air to the mouth, to the airways, to the lung, to the little small airways called alveoli? There are over 23 million of them. And how does that molecule move to the alveoli through the alveolar membrane? On the other side of the alveolar membrane is blood plasma. In the blood plasma is a red blood cell. Before it gets to the blood plasma, it must first go through the tissue space between the little capillary and the alveolar membrane. So that oxygen molecule is moving through the airways, into the alveoli, through the alveolar membrane, through the tissue space, where now it must penetrate the capillary membrane, go through the capillary, enter the blood plasma, find the red blood cell, which has a membrane, penetrate the red blood cell, find the hemoglobin molecule, and chemically attach itself to the hemoglobin molecule. Then it must be transported from the lung to the big toe. And during that entire transit journey, it must hold on to that oxygen molecule so that when it arrives to the tissue space, the muscle cell or the lymph node cell or the stem cell in the bone marrow, it must release that oxygen to that cell. It must go through the cell membrane into the tissue fluid of the cell, and it must penetrate the mitochondria, which is an organelle of the cell, which is called the powerhouse of the cell, which allows a chemical reaction to produce adenosine triphosphate, a high phosphate bond that produces all the energy. So how does that happen? It happens because of the discovery of the relationship between the pressure of oxygen in arterial blood and the saturation of hemoglobin. For the last 3 months, we've heard pulse oximetry. We've talked about oxygen saturation. What is oxygen saturation? Oxygen saturation represents the ratio on the right, oxygen saturation, of the content of oxygen over the capacity, divided by the capacity of oxygen. How is that determined? That's determined by taking the hemoglobin molecule and the portion of the hemoglobin molecule that can form oxyhemoglobin. So there's a portion of the hemoglobin molecule which can chemically attach to oxygen, as opposed to what's the potential for all the hemoglobin to attach with oxygen. So how much is there relative to how much can be there? And there's a constant, that is, for each gram of hemoglobin, 1.39 milliliters or cc's of oxygen per gram it can carry. So each gram of hemoglobin. So we can begin to appreciate in anemia, hemoglobin is reduced so that patients and subjects with anemia, their hemoglobin can be saturated with oxygen, but the total oxygen carried by the blood is less, is reduced. So now let's look at the oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve. And what does it tell us? Well, let's look at we have the ordinate with oxygen saturation and the abscissa, which looks at the partial pressure of oxygen in arterial blood. And note that the values go from 0 all the way up to above 600. We'll talk about that. How does it get to be 600? Well, obviously, if we increase the oxygen concentration of air, the pressure that that gas exerts in the fluid, in the blood, increases. So room air at 21% oxygen has about 150 millimeters of oxygen. 100% oxygen in air has 760 millimeters of oxygen, way out here on the curve. But if we look and see what happens to oxyhemoglobin, you see that at 100%, it's up about 150, 200 millimeters of oxygen. In other words, room air, just enough, 21% oxygen, completely saturates the hemoglobin with 100%. And if we increase the oxygen above 21%, it doesn't appreciably make a difference in the hemoglobin molecule and how much it can carry. So that's why normally Homo sapiens are happy breathing room air, 21%. But what happens if that room air is compromised? Let us say that all of a sudden we have a little obstruction to the airflow in the airways. Let's say that there's some fluid in the airways. There's some inflammation in the airways, which allow the oxygen to decrease in the airways. Well, we can begin to understand how less oxygen reduces the pressure of oxygen and saturates lesser and lesser amounts of hemoglobin. Now, just for reference, venous blood is around 35 millimeters of mercury, right about here. So if I look to see what is the saturation, there is about 75% saturation of hemoglobin in venous blood. So the transition, the delivery of oxygen is between these 95%, 98% level and 75% level. That's the working range of the hemoglobin molecule. That's when it's happy. If we can begin to understand small reductions in oxygen beyond that point, we call this the steep part of the curve. So very minor reductions in oxygen reduce the ability of hemoglobin to carry it. And at this state, the lowest you can go is right around this point right here. At this level, aerobic metabolism ceases. What is aerobic metabolism? Aerobic metabolism is the utilization of oxygen to produce high energy ATP in that mitochondria that we talked about. And we'll look at that. Anaerobic metabolism, that is production of energy with just the production of acid. That's where you get to lactic acid. And that's down here in the curve. When we take in a breath, inspiration, 71% nitrogen is in the air, 21% oxygen, very little carbon dioxide, although greenhouse gases are adding to it. When we exhale, there is still 78% nitrogen. Not much changes with the nitrogen, but oxygen decreases. And as John Dalton suggested, when we decrease oxygen from 21% to 16%, that 5% difference is taken up by carbon dioxide, right here. So exhaled air has less oxygen and more carbon dioxide. Now don't be confused, I know, presenting a table like this. But look at the levels of the table. We call this the partial pressure oxygen cascade. Recall earlier we talked about the air, and ambient air, the lung, the blood, the tissues, the mitochondria, and we even talked about aerobic metabolism to produce adenosine triphosphate, that high energy phosphate that makes energy happen, makes the cells work. And look at this last column here. According to Dalton, the total pressure is always the same. What changes are the relative contributions of each of the gases, oxygen and carbon dioxide. And now we add water vapor. Where does water vapor come from? Well, water vapor comes from our bodies. We produce water, it comes from the oceans and the air, and that's discussed as the dew point, or relative humidity in ambient air. Now, one of the benefits of breathing and one of the functions of respiration is convective cooling. How do we maintain our body temperature? You know, when you increase activity, your body temperature increases. How does the body eliminate temperature and control our temperature to a constant temperature of 98.7 degrees Fahrenheit? Well, it does it through the use of water and water vapor. When we warm air and we saturate air with water vapor at body temperature, the pressure of water is 47 millimeters of mercury at body temperature. It's 37 degrees centigrade, 98.7 degrees Fahrenheit. So when we breathe in, we warm the air, we evaporate water from our body, and that controls body temperature. It loses heat when it does that. So water vapor, because we're at constant temperature, water vapor is always 47 degrees. On room air, when we breathe in, there's less relative humidity. We add water to it, we lose water. The difference between air, the partial pressure of oxygen as air is 150 millimeters of mercury. The partial pressure of oxygen in increased oxygen in air, which is what is produced by the R15. It produces 100% oxygen, but it has vent holes in the mask, so it mixes and reduces the oxygen to about 35%. That gives us a partial pressure of oxygen about 250. That is compensated for by the decrease in nitrogen. So the total pressure is the same, but the partial pressure of oxygen in air is 585, and because of the increase in oxygen concentration, nitrogen partial pressure is reduced to 463. Now let's look at the exhaled air. The exhaled air has 25 millimeters of mercury of carbon dioxide. Why doesn't the exhaled air of the R15 have 25 millimeters of oxygen? That is because the flow of oxygen across the mouth removes it. Therefore, it removes all the CO2, so the next breath is helped by not having the CO2 and increasing the oxygen. The partial pressures and total pressures are still the same. So let's look at the arterial and venous blood. We now have the same partial pressure of oxygen, of CO2 in arterial and venous blood as you have with the R15 and without the R15. We still have the same water vapor. However, the nitrogen is less. So the oxygen is helped, is more. In the tissues, the same thing. But we just increase the partial pressure of oxygen in tissues by just a little bit. And recall that curve, that's that steep part of the curve. So you have more oxygen to liberate itself from the oxyhemoglobin. And just these small incremental increases facilitate aerobic metabolism. So the benefits of oxygen are that it creates energy, it digests food, it eliminates toxins, it fuels the muscles, it metabolizes fat and carbohydrates, it removes viruses and parasites and harmful bacteria, it strengthens the immune system, it manufactures hormones and proteins, it keeps the heart going. You know, hearts stop without oxygen, brains die without oxygen. And also it stimulates the lung to breathe and allows the nervous system to function normally. Now, why emergency oxygen? What's important about having oxygen? An adult breathing fewer than 12 or 20 breaths per minute. Normally, as we're sitting here, we measured your respiratory rate. You'd be breathing at 12 to 15 times a minute. You'd be allowing 5 seconds for inspiration and expiration each breath, and you would be breathing faster in than out. So we allow, usually it's a 3-to-1 ratio. So you spend 3 times more exhaling than you do inhaling. And children and infants breathe faster, as you know, but they have the same kind of oxygen and CO2 requirements. So we know that when you have airway obstruction, due to asthma, inhalation of some substance or particle. You have an allergic response. The airways constrict, and the ability to take a deep breath is reduced. Or if you have a cardiac emergency where the heart stops, oxygen, even though you can ventilate, you can't move oxygen to the tissues. In drowning, we know that water in the airways prevent airways constrict because they see a foreign substance and the breathing is compromised. So that we know that getting resuscitation as soon as possible to any compromised airway or compromised heart is what's important. So we know that administering supplemental oxygen is the most important step in treatment. You need oxygen for every other function to survive. And now I will turn it over to Andy, who will talk about oxygen and its why emergency oxygen. Thank you, Andy.
Thanks, Richard. So a lot of people don't realize that there are, in fact, 20 times as many breathing emergencies in this country as there are cardiac events. And specifically, for many of you who are involved in schools, 25% of all 911 calls from school emergencies are related to breathing emergencies. And there's over 4,000 Americans that die from asthma every year. And as Richard talked about, the critical nature of oxygen, within 2 minutes, brain damage can begin. And as many of you know, depending on the physical location and geography of an individual school or educational facility, sometimes a trainer or nurse cannot be close enough to get to a potential breathing emergency victim within that period of time. And so what we're here to emphasize is getting public access oxygen into the hands of first responders is key. So we asked the question, why public access oxygen? And here's some quotes from some prominent emergency oxygen physicians. And I think consistently they all agree that being able to have available emergency supplemental oxygen to civilian bystanders can make a difference. And that's true in any public space. For bystanders to access and apply supplemental oxygen as a bridge to EMS arrival. And further, if you look at what Dr. Golden says on the third point, is you don't have to worry if a victim needs oxygen because there is no harm in providing it within the typical response time. So it should absolutely be administered. Now, as we talked about, there's over 7 million medical events that involve emergency oxygen. And oxygen is also preventative in a cardiac event. But as you see on the right-hand side, there are so many other areas where emergency oxygen can be relevant, whether it's an asthma attack, an allergic reaction, as Richard talked about, or just dehydration or exhaustion on a playing field. And schools are among, here you see in bold, among the most prominent places where there's an assembling of people for which a breathing emergency could happen. Now, unfortunately, we're all experiencing, through the opioid crisis, increased drug overdoses. And the Department of Health and Human Services has put together their opioid toolkit, and which are the 5 essential steps for first responders to a drug overdose victim. And as you can see, highlighted in blue, critical to the treatment here is before, during, and after the administration of Narcan or Naloxone, oxygen is definitely prescribed. So there's really four major types of oxygen delivery systems, which many of you are familiar with. Pressurized oxygen cylinders that are available in a variety of sizes, oxygen concentrators, which are often used in a home situation for supplemental oxygen, which could be either plug-in models or battery-powered portable models. Most hospitals have liquid oxygen piping systems with large external tanks to provide oxygens to ERs and operating rooms and rooms in general throughout the hospital. And then there are oxygen generating devices such as Rapid Oxygen R15. An important characteristic is certain types of oxygen delivery systems are more appropriate than others. For example, cylinders require a physician's prescription. They have to be stored in a fire protective cabinet. They require some annual maintenance and some routine personnel training. So as we talked about before, those critical first few minutes can make all of the difference between a positive outcome and a negative outcome. On the previous slide, one of the things I failed to talk about is the Wisconsin EMS did a study that said for every minute of improved response time, there's a 10% improved chance of survival, meaning better outcomes when a person ultimately gets treated. And as you can see from this slide, 2 minutes, as we said, permanent brain damage can begin, and much longer than that can lead to death. So getting emergency oxygen to a victim of a breathing emergency in that gap, with first responders on average in the United States about 8 minutes, 11 seconds responding. And as many of you heard, with COVID, response times have increased upwards of 12 minutes and more in some municipalities. So when we talk about the R15 as one of the oxygen delivery systems generating oxygen chemically, one of the things that the R15 does is, as we said, it is totally safe. In essence, it is the only device that is approved to be in public spaces, not having to be stored in fireproof cabinets. It's very simple to use. It's a good companion device. We'll talk about that in a second. And it's really part of the best practices for Good Samaritans. Here's just a quick comparison chart of different delivery systems, whether they require power, how much oxygen they provide, whether they're explosive or not, whether they require additional training, how accessible they are. For example, the R15 is able to be safely transported in a moving vehicle without any special placarding. As we said, oxygen cylinder, pressurized oxygen cylinders come in a number of sizes. Typically, people are carrying them in the lower end of the scale, and the R15 amount of oxygen is very consistent with the amount of oxygen in those smaller tanks. And as we said, it does require a prescription, unlike the oxygen generator. And the oxygen provided by the R15 is very simple to use because it's targeted at Good Samaritan, bridging the gap before trained professional EMS arrive, and simply turning of a handle and attaching a mask. Now, many of you already have a bag mask resuscitator on hand, and the R15 is totally compatible with the universal oxygen port. And the important point here is that, as Richard talked about before, when you're providing 100% oxygen in through a mask, you're replacing some of the CO2 that's being exhaled by the breathing emergency victim with pure oxygen. So instead of going from the 21% down to the 16% and subsequently lower percentages of oxygen, you're augmenting the exhaled air, you're replacing the CO2 with pure oxygen. Again, as we talked about, emergency oxygen of any type is a perfect companion to your existing emergency preparedness plan. And increasingly, schools, universities are broadening their preparedness, not only to include, of course, the fire extinguisher and the AEDs, which have come increasingly over the past 20 years, but things like Narcan, Naloxone to address opioid overdoses, EpiPens for allergic reactions, and even stop the bleed kits, unfortunately, because of active shooter situations, which we've come across. So thanks again for your time, and we're happy to take some questions along the way, and I'll turn it back over to Ryan. Thanks.
Thank you, Richard and Andy, for your time. That's great presentation with a lot of great information in there. I would invite everybody on the line, if they've got questions, go ahead and send your questions in through the questions interface and go to webinar, and we can begin to answer those. I'm seeing I've got a question here from Sandy. We can start with that one. Sandy asks if there is an age range for children where oxygen is appropriate, and are children over 12 considered adults when it comes to oxygen use?
Yes, oxygen, 15 minutes of 100% oxygen, as we presented, can harm no one. Neonates are affected by high concentrations of oxygen, but beyond that, everyone can sustain 100% of oxygen for 15 minutes. And as I suggested, you're not really getting 100% oxygen with our system because it's diluted in the mask. So the most that is delivered is about 35%, and it's completely safe.
Okay, thank you. Mark is asking a question about athletes on the playing field, saying that for many years, athletic trainers, coaches have been taught that during the game on the sidelines, oxygen is not appropriate or not beneficial to athletes who are not in distress, but only have depleted oxygen as a normal course of being winded. Do you have any comments on that as to why the teaching has been that it's not appropriate or not beneficial if an athlete is not in distress?
Right. Well, you know, short-term relief. We all understand that the first sign of oxygen starvation is anxiety and hyperventilation and an increase in heart rate. So breathing 100% oxygen by mask or any increases in oxygen will just reduce the time for recovery. So it typically doesn't improve outcomes. It improves the time to recovery and anxiety. But there is no particular benefit, long-term benefit, but also there's no untoward side effect.
Okay, thank you. Kent is asking how long the R15 unit will provide oxygen.
Right. The FDA guideline has a minimum of 15 minutes and a minimum flow of 6 liters per minute. So that's the performance and the label that the device performs. It actually has 150 liters of oxygen. And if we just do a quick multiplication, you know, 15 liters, 6 liters a minute at 15 minutes is 90 liters. So there's an extra 60 liters of oxygen in the box that is produced. It is just not produced at the higher flow. So there's a fall off in flow for the next 4 or 5 minutes after the 15 minutes.
Okay, thank you. And I'm seeing a question here from Glenn. It sounds like it's been answered by the information you just gave us. Glenn is asking how many liters per minute does the R15 deliver?
Yes.
Oh, go ahead, sorry.
No, just 6 liters per minute.
Okay, 15. Great. And then a couple of questions about the performance of the unit itself. Does it have an expiration date? How long does it last as far as, you know, before the R15 expires? And also, does it need to be regularly inspected like an AED does, regular maintenance? If so, what are people looking for?
Sure. Thank you for the question. The R15 is a single-use disposable device. Once it's activated, it must completely, it's a chemical reaction. So that all of the oxygen must be utilized and you can't reverse it. So it has a 2-year shelf life. It's a drug. So there is a shelf life, there is an expiration date on the device. And according to FDA labeling, it must perform as indicated on the label for that period of time. Did I answer all the questions?
Yep, absolutely. And so then once it has been reused,
does not require any maintenance. It's as I said, it's a single-use device.
Okay.
It does not require any attending or service.
Okay. And then since it is a single-use device, that means that once it has been used, it needs to be replaced. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay.
All right, great. Thank you.
Great. Thank you.
As far as the use of the device itself, is there any adjustments that need to be made to it while you're using it, or is it a situation where you just kind of set it and let it go? Is everything automatic once the device is turned on?
Yes, once you initiate the turning of the handle, we recommend turning the handle completely 90 degrees, and that is to allow the device to perform at its intended use. If you just turn it, there's a ratchet on the handle, so you cannot reverse the handle once you begin to move it. So it cannot be turned off or turned back. Once you initiate it, the reaction proceeds and you cannot stop it until it's exhausted, by the device exhausts itself.
Okay. Let's talk about storage. Storage of the unit, would it be okay if it were, for example, taken on a field trip in a school bus and the school bus was hot while the students were, in a building or something? Are there temperature extremes that we need to be aware of? Basic storage and guidelines for this?
Yes. Like any drug, it wants to be at room temperature to perform. If the environment is hot, extremely hot, the temperature of the device will increase and the flow will increase. So if it's out of its storage operating range, that's above 75 degrees Fahrenheit or so, incrementally, it will produce higher flow. And when it begins to encroach on its ability to perform, it might perform for fewer minutes. So the higher flow will reduce its time of producing the oxygen. On the other hand, if it's cooled, it will produce lower flow. So it actually can be frozen. However, it takes 24 hours to keep stored at room temperature to perform again as the label indicates. So heat and cold do not affect performance as long as the storage, as long as the operating temperature is maintained.
Okay, great, thank you. Question here from Barry, asking if you can explain the difference between a rebreather mask versus a nasal cannula.
Sure. So as we know, a nasal cannula are 2 prongs which go in the nose. And typically, mouth breathing, when you inhale through your mouth, you entrain the air that comes through the nose. So a nasal cannula doesn't produce, so not only, we talked about you have 100% oxygen. Now the benefit of the R15 when used with the R15 can be used with a nasal cannula. We provide it with a mask just to facilitate. It's easy to put a mask on as opposed to insert a nasal cannula. But the benefit of the R15 is that the air delivered by the R15 is warmed and humidified to body temperature. So that as opposed to a gas cylinder without a humidifier, when you release compressed gas from a cylinder, it's cold and it's dry. And if you use a nasal cannula with a gas cylinder, it will irritate, the gas will irritate the nares and actually cause them dry and crusty. So that oxygen from a cylinder must be conditioned. Usually you'll see a humidifier with it, associated with it. The R15 provides warmed and humidified gases. A mask, there are several types of masks. The mask that is used on our device has vent holes, so the air is entrained as you breathe in and out. You notice there are masks with bags on them. Those are called partial rebreathing bags. And what happens is the oxygen, 100% oxygen goes into the bag, and you inhale from the bag, and you entrain air at the same time. So there, the concentration of oxygen from a partial rebreathing bag is upwards of 45%, 40, 45%. It's about 10% higher than a mask without a bag and with holes in it. Then there are non-rebreathing masks, which have a valve, an inspiratory valve, on where the bag is attached to the mask, so that as you inhale from the bag, the valve closes on exhalation and prevents the exhaled air from going back into the mask and the bag. And then there are exhale valves on the mask itself. So the exhaled air is diverted from the bag, which is now accumulating oxygen, because recall we talked about you spend more time exhaling than inhaling. So the oxygen is flowing constantly. So the bag that's attached to the mask with that valve on it is now beginning to fill to a larger volume during your exhalation. So you're exhaling through the mask itself with its one-way valve, and only it's an exhalation valve. So now the CO2 now is in that mask. And now when you take in your next breath, you're getting the last part of your exhalate, which has some CO2 in it. So there are non-rebreathing and rebreathing masks as a function of where the valves are and where the inspiratory and expiratory valves are. I hope I explained that properly, but I'm happy to elaborate even more.
I think we followed you. Thank you, Richard.
Okay.
I've got a question here from Sandy, and I'll go ahead and answer this one. Sandy is asking where we can see a demo of the R15. Sandy, the gentleman from Rapid Oxygen have been nice enough to provide us with a video, and we can include that on the follow-up emails that come out after this presentation. So you will be able to watch a demo video of the R15 unit. Additionally, if you would like to contact your school health sales representative, we can make sure that we can get a demo unit in front of you if you have questions or if you'd like to see it physically and talk about the uses. So watch for the follow-up emails after this webinar. And if you'd like to see one in person, reach out to us at School Health and we can pair you up with your sales representative for a demo. A question for Denise, or from Denise here. When we're talking about pulse ox levels, is there a level below which you would recommend O2 delivery?
Yes. As we talked about in that presentation of the oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve, anything below 94% saturation is a failure. There's no C and B and a B plus and an A minus. Either you pass or you fail. If the oxyhemoglobin doesn't leave the lung with at minimum of 94% saturation, that is the definition of hypoxemia. So anything below 94%, even though you're taught generally the CDC, they talk about 92%, already you have hypoxemia between 94 and 92%. That's abnormal. You begin to have anxiety, which is the first sign of oxygen starvation. You have an increase in heart rate, tachycardia, increase in heart rate, and anxiety are the first symptoms of hypoxemia.
Okay, thank you. Question on disposal of the unit after it has been used. Is there anything special that people would need to do when disposing of this? Any kind of special handling that it requires?
No, it's perfectly safe to dispose of it by any method that you normally dispose of any disposable.
Okay. And then a question from Marianne on the weight of the unit itself.
Yes. The weight is about 18 pounds. And the reason for that, it's chemistry. You have to pack enough powder in there to produce that volume of oxygen. And we can't change the gas laws to our accommodation, we can't change chemistry.
Okay, thank you. All right, the remaining questions that I'm seeing here, I'm seeing a lot of questions about cost of the unit. And again, on the follow-up emails that we send out after this webinar, we will include a link for purchasing the R15 unit if anyone is interested in doing that. So that will take you through to our school health website. If you're looking at bulk purchasing or need a quote, please reach out to us at School Health and we can help you get pricing through that manner. With that, it looks like we are out of questions, and so I'll go ahead and wrap up the presentation. Thank you to both Dr. Richard Imbruce and to Andy Russell for your time today. This has been a lot of great information. We really appreciate you taking the time to go through this with us. And after we leave the webinar today, I just wanted to remind everybody that there will be a survey that pops up on your computer. Please take a few moments to fill out the survey and let us know how we're doing here, if there's information that was helpful to you, or if there's information that you would have liked to have seen, but we didn't cover, please let us know that. And again, your certificate of attendance will be coming out later this afternoon by email. Please keep an eye on your email for that, and we will also email out some other resources to you in the coming days as well. So just watch your inbox for information from us here at School Health. And with that, I will end today's broadcast. Thank you all for joining us.
Well, thank you all very much. Thank you, Brian.
Thank you.